Well, hello, I'm your host, Kim Westlund, and thanks so much for joining. Today, I've invited my friend and amazingly talented entrepreneur, Ernest Barbaric, to talk with me about facing some difficult personal challenges that he began experiencing not that long ago, and how some of those challenges really affected his business, his family, his health, amongst other things. And the reason that we're talking about this today is because Ernest found himself a little bit stuck on how to move forward. So we're going to dig into some of those details and we'll let Ernest explain the situation that he was in. But first of all, Ernest is an executive coach who helps impact driven entrepreneurs, CEOs, and their teams beat the odds. I love that intro. It's so simple and it's just speaks to what you do, Ernest. So welcome to you, my friend.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's so good to connect. I'm so glad that we reconnected. And like we were mentioning before the show started, I used to run a podcast conference. I used to do a lot of
Yes.
podcasting, and it's been a long time since I've been on one or produced one. So I'm really glad that it's you that's doing it with me.
Oh, I'm so thrilled to have you here. And yeah, you're no stranger to this and you're so talented in this space. Is there anything you want to add to the intro to kind of what you do?
Good question. I'm guessing that might be something that we'll touch on a little bit later, as well as we go through our conversation. It's been a interesting, twisty career journey for me. I've gone from electronics engineering to marketing strategy to building a company in that space, and making a transition then about 5 years ago into the coaching space and working with entrepreneurs one on one. In that time, man, I got hit with so many different things that what you mentioned last year was probably one of the hardest years, but there have been so many things along the way that have really changed it, shifted what I thought was important, what I resonated with, how I live my life, and the decisions that we make as a family and myself make as an individual. And I feel like there's obviously a lot more to it, but I'm happy to explore with you.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think we all face unexpected losses of some kind in our lives. We will all go through that. And that's kind of the premise of what we're talking about today. And we need to find ways to overcome them and carry on. And in your case, you lost your dad last year. And it kind of came out of left field from what I understand. And it's been quite a journey through the grief and finding healthy ways of moving forward with a new outlook. So we're going to discuss that. But first, we used to live in the same city. And when you made a big move with your family a few years ago to the West Coast, just for context, and you started a whole new life there, because I think somehow that's all built into this story. And there's been a lot of really big changes in the past few years. So who is Ernest? What gets you up in the morning? And what gifts and talents and passions do you put to work every day?
I thought about this and the best way to present it, and I don't know if I still have a good answer for it, but I'll tell you this. The things that get me up in the morning have shifted over time. So as
Mm.
I've had different experiences, as priorities have shifted, as I've learned more about myself and the impact that I want to create, there was a lot of self work that was done in that time. Some of those have shifted. So that being said, I find that there's kind of levels to it. So on one level, my family is incredibly important to me. That's number one. That comes up before anything else. So that's why I do anything really. Then after that, on more of a macro scale, what really drives me, and this is something I've come to terms with after quite a few different conversations with different assessments, from debriefs, from coaches, from even some therapy work, from a number of different sources, is that really what drives me is that I want to make some kind of a positive difference while I'm still alive.
Mm.
And that is if you were to distill me down to an essence, that would be one thing. That's what I derive a lot of meaning from. And for me, it really comes down to, and this might sound, I don't know, maybe it's obtuse or maybe it sounds like a big thing, but I want to build the kind of future that I want my kiddo to live in. I want to be
Yeah.
able to say, 20 years from now or 10 years from now, that I have made a tiny contribution towards making things better for everybody. So whether that means, and for me, I call it, sorry, what were you going to say? I think I heard you, I heard you take a breath, and it usually means a
Mm.
question.
No, I was going to say how much that resonates with me as a parent. So when you talk about your kid having an impact on what you do, I completely resonate with that.
I
Yeah.
feel like we are in this interesting period of time right now where there are so many intersecting things that are happening at the same time that we need people that are going to be the merchants of hope to help pull us in the right direction. And so I aspire to be one of the people that makes a tiny contribution in that space. I thought about this. I did a workshop with an organization last year, and I kind of codified my way of thinking about this kind of future, and I call it RISE, which stands for
Mm.
Resilient, Innovative, Sustainable, and Equitable. And it's the kind of future where I would love to see less fear, less scarcity, less suffering, more access to education, more access to healthcare, more opportunities for those who want to try things, and more of a sense of safety for all of us. And so, whatever it is that I can do to make that happen, to make a tiny contribution in that space, whether it's working with entrepreneurs or whether it's launching a project of some kind or a podcast or whatever it is, that's what guides my work.
Wow, that's a tall order. And I will just applaud you right out of the gate because I think you've touched on so many things in that statement that our world is lacking in at the moment. And so you just even having a finger on a pulse to some of those things and wanting to be, I love that, a merchant of hope. Wow. I'm going to be following and tracking your journey, Ernest, because that's what I feel like is going to change how our children will live in future years. So that is amazing. Last year, you unexpectedly lost your father. How has that really? I mean, it might seem like a simple question, but how has that really impacted your life personally and professionally? Because this was unexpected. This was kind of like a bit of a sideswipe from how you've described it to me. So could you just kind of walk us through that period of time?
Sure. I want to add some context to this, just so everybody can get on the same page.
Hmm.
I'm not from Canada originally. I was born in what is now the ex-Yugoslavia, and so when I was a kid, I lived through civil war. So I've been shot at. My city's been shelled. We left that city, me and my mom, on a city bus to try and. There was one convoy, the last UN convoy that ever exited that city. We were on it, and my dad had to stay behind.
Wow.
So I'm just saying that as a way to set some context around how important and how tight our family is, how much we've gone through together, and how much I relied on them for just being with me. So another piece of context that might be interesting to know is that, or important to know, I should say, is that in 2012, my mom passed away from after an 8-month battle with lung cancer, and that
Okay.
was a huge, devastating hit. And so after she passed away, I really started questioning all of the decisions that I've made up until this point. At that point in time, I had a business that was doing really well. I was teaching at different universities. I was speaking at conferences. Things were going externally well. However, there was some nugget of something missing for me, and I couldn't really put my finger on it. And after she passed away, I really got to questioning what am I doing? Later that year, I came across an article by Sir Ray Avery, who's this amazing New Zealand inventor who created baby incubators for brownout conditions. He did some really amazing things to help people with eyesight in third world countries, and to reduce cataract surgery. I think at the point in time from $30 per eye to $3 per eye. He did some really amazing things, and he wrote this
Oh,
article
wow.
that said you have 30,000 days of life to live in total, and so how are you basically prioritizing your time that you have? That I read that about 6 months after my mom passed away, and I was still in deep grief, and that really resonated for me. So then I looked at my family history, and I calculated just based on my family history, I have 26,000 days of life in total. And so that number then got me to think about how do I find and do more meaningful work. So that started the one of the podcasts that I built at the time. It's called 26K. I've since archived it, and so that gives you another point of reference. So then last year, what happened is that my dad is a very or was a very healthy person. So he's done hikes with us recently, and we flew him out to the West Coast to hang out with us and do hikes and walks and all these kind of things. Incredibly healthy. He went into the ER. So he was healthy in the morning. He went into the ER that afternoon because he started developing some abdominal pains. And it turned out it was something related to a gallstone, which somehow, then, as we later found out, ended up damaging his pancreas, and it created a whole bunch of things as a result, a whole bunch of complications as a result. And so after he went in that afternoon, it was one thing after another, and 3 months later he was gone suddenly. We were actually literally flying out on a plane to go and bring him home from the hospital. When my sister called and she was in the hospital, they called her to be with him. That was devastating. It still is. It's been, so it was in July of last year, so it's been almost a year. I've dealt with grief before, but what ended up happening is that all of the things that I thought that I had under control, all of the things that I thought I had handled, anxiety, depression, stress, all of these different things, when he passed away and after that initial shock kind of wore off, all of those things got ripped open and amplified. So I was in this space, I was in this experience where all of the anxieties that I've had before, the fears, all of these different things were now not only back, but they were back stronger, because now not only all of this was happening, but I felt alone in a way. So I don't have any
Mm.
more surviving parents. And I talk to my mom every day, and then I talk to my dad every day. And so losing that was a huge hit. It's a loss of a massive magnitude for me personally. Different people might relate to it differently, and I totally understand that. And so it really left me in this place where it just kind of it cut it cut me at the knees. So or whatever the expression is,
Hmm.
I lost confidence, I lost drive. I basically stopped doing everything just to be in this space. And I work with a counselor as well, which really helped. But at the end of the day, the impact was so huge that I basically stopped everything else. And I think that impact also had an impact on my family. And as you know, work obviously as well, because I stopped doing any business development or client work at that point in time outside of what I already promised or was committed to. And so everything kind of stopped for a year, and I took a big hit to my confidence, a big hit to so many different things, and it was quite a blow.
You said it well when you said everybody experiences a little differently. And just, I appreciate the detail that you went into there, because I was just kind of lost in what you were talking about in terms of just the impact that your parents had on you, what their loss has meant to you, and just how you framed that, and just how everything had to stop for you. It's interesting how the loss of a parent or somebody so close to you can make you question so many. Just I really appreciate you digging in and really unpacking what your parents meant to you. And so you mentioned your family, and out of all this, and I'll let you get into the details, but you also then started to experience some health challenges. And I know you mentioned stress, anxiety, depression. What happened at that point, and how did your family respond? Because that's a lot. Like, this is a heavy, heavy weight that is now
Mm.
you're experiencing in your life.
So I just want to recognize that everybody processes things differently.
Yeah.
I think grief, loss, and adversity are universal experiences. However, we can all process it differently. Some folks are able to stay unattached. Some folks are able to stay compartmentalized if needed. Some folks take things very deeply, emotionally, and personally. And so for me, it was a deep personal and emotional loss. And so there's a few things that happened as a result. So having worked with a grief counselor last year, that really helped me in the immediate term. I thought that was a smart decision in hindsight in terms of building a support system immediately. However, having intellectually worked through some of those things that happen in grief, and grief is also, just so everybody knows, very non-linear. There are days that will be very different than other days. There are moments that will be different than other moments. It's an emotional roller coaster, and it's very unpredictable. Sometimes there are things that can trigger certain thoughts or feelings or emotions, and then you will go into one, let's call it a hole. You'll go into a hole, and then a couple of hours later you might be in a different place. So it's a very dysregulating experience. That being said, what ended up happening, and I guess we're going into this, I don't know, this will be interesting for people to know as well. So for me, the way that I related to that experience was as a tremendous amount of extreme stress. And so having worked with a grief counselor, I got to the point where I intellectually thought that I had, let's call it, like, a handle on things. Felt like I was getting better,
Hmm.
and having worked through a few of those things. However, what ended up happening with me at the tail end of last year is that I just started developing some health problems that were completely out of the blue. So I started with with a very strong pain in my abdomen. And so the first thought that popped into my mind was, this is similar thing that happened with my dad. And
Mm,
the worst thing. So like, having been hit with so many things, I often tend to think of the worst scenarios that could possibly happen.
so then all of a sudden fear is trying to
Yeah,
grip you. Yeah.
absolutely. And so I ended up developing these pains. We were circling around the ER thinking that my appendix was about to burst. That's how intense it was. And eventually it kind of subsided. And then it kind of went away later that day. So it was just a weird experience. And then as time progressed, since like different pains started happening in my abdomen. And I also started developing a involuntary twitches. So one of my fingers would just kind of randomly start twitching. My eye would
Mm,
randomly start twitching. And in my mind, I'm like, oh crap, like, is this neurodegenerative disease? Like, what is even happening? I don't even know. There are so many things happening at the same time that didn't even make any sense.
right.
So I ended up working with a couple of doctors that sent me for a series of blood tests and sent me for ultrasound. And when all of those tests came back, I expected, this is it. I don't know if I'm going to be around in 6 months, because that was my experience, lived experience through all of the things that happened with my family and people that I know. However, when the results came back, there wasn't anything that was causing. They couldn't point to anything that was causing all of these sensations. So then my therapist and I created a hypothesis that could this possibly be stress related. So in other words, this could have been what's called a somatization of stress, of unresolved stress. So when you go through a really high emotionally distressful period of time, even though intellectually you might have, let's call it a handle on things, your body still has an impact on your body. So somatically, sometimes this can come out in some really unexpected ways. And so for me, that was all of these crazy physical symptoms that I have literally never experienced before in my life, even though I've experienced extreme stress before. I
Hmm.
have never experienced this before. And at that point in time, while I was going through this, one of the thoughts that occurred to me was, I don't know if I'm going to get to see summer. And that's a very, I don't even know, sobering isn't the right word, but that's a very different place to be in.
Because then there's a timeline. You've now placed a timeline on things. And for me, it's just, it's such an eye opening experience to hear or thought to hear you explain the emotions and the thought patterns and how stress, and we've heard this. I'm sure most of us have heard how impactful stress is on on our lives, but to have it carry out in your body that way, if somebody's listening, that might be a wake up call today to even be paying attention to those things and to understand how important it is to deal with whatever that trauma or stress or loss or whatever that may be in your life, to pay attention to the warning signs, because there's things that you may be able to do to alleviate that. So I have to ask you, what did you do
Mm.
specifically to kind of harness those thoughts, Ernest, and help you regulate, because that had to have been really scary to experience these things coming out physically.
I'll add one more element to this, and that is, there have been times in my life when I have been close to, had some close brushes with motorcycle racing and all kinds of different things. It's very different in this context because I now have a family, I now have a kiddo, and
Yeah.
so it's a very different way to relate to that kind of experience. On some level, I'm not necessarily afraid of death. What does scare me still is, how will my family be if I'm gone? That's a very different context that I find myself in now that I would have been as opposing 20 years ago or something. All of that being said, once I got the medical imaging done and the blood test came back, and there wasn't really anything that would have been causal of the experience that I was having. Like I said, we created a hypothesis: could this possibly be stress related? So then, if that was the case, so there's an interesting thing that happens, and one is the elimination of the worst case scenario. So if it's not that, it's going to be something else, and if it's going to be something
Right.
else, then I can figure it out. And I think this kind of flows into the kind of personality that the entrepreneurs will have. If there's a problem, I figure I can solve it, and it can be used in some really strange ways, like this. If this was a problem and we knew the worst case scenario wasn't the reality, so how do we actually go about building a process to get out of this? A couple of years ago, I recorded a series with a neuroscientist here at UVic, Dr. Olaf Krigelson, around the idea of using neuroscience in leadership. So we went over a number of different things, one of which was around the idea of creating cognitive longevity. So we talked about brain health and impact of stress, and what are the things that you have to do in order to preserve your cognitive capacity as you get older and as you go through
Hmm.
stress. And then I used the research that I've done with my therapist. Then I've used the research that I've done with all of the different things that I've done over the years, everything from spiritual practices to meditation to the things that I was really interested in when I was going through a period of depression in 2016. And I put together a protocol in a way. And so that protocol consisted of a few different things. I've done a video about this as well on my LinkedIn profile. So there's a few things that I put into place. Number one was sleep. So sleep is incredibly important. And so for me, that meant, for me specifically, the practice that I put into place was going to sleep at the same time and waking up around the same time, just so I can retrain my body to sleep and brain to rest. So sleep is currently being researched as one of the major components to actually increasing cognitive longevity and preventing neurodegenerative disease. So it's incredibly important to let your body go and your brain go through the cycle of sleep. And so in addition to that, I also looked at some supplementation. I tried a few different things, but I settled on a small dose of magnesium. And magnesium is also supposed to replenish your neurotransmitters while you sleep. So that's one component.
Okay.
Then I looked at diet. And so when you're stressed out, our body often will crave unhealthy foods. What I've put into place, understanding that stress also creates inflammation. So I put together a diet that was based on anti-inflammatory properties as much as possible. And then in addition to that, I also did some research on how our gut bacteria or your microbiota is going to affect your mood. And so I addressed that in two different ways. One was using mood boosting probiotics, and the other one was eating fermented foods as much as possible. So, what is it called? That drink, kombucha, sauerkraut, kefir, some of those kind of things that had lots of bacteria and helpful bacteria. Yogurt that had lots of helpful bacteria in it. So that
Yeah.
was another thing that I put into place. Number three was exercise. Exercise is incredibly important for completing the stress cycle, which is something that a lot of us don't do that work in white collar jobs. And so for me, it was a combination of a few different things. So one is strength training to increase bone density and prevent neurodegenerative disease, and the other one was low steady state running, which is zone 2 training, and then I do sprints on Saturdays. So I work out 6 days a week, and that was something that just kind of helped me create a cadence and have a win as well every day. Then I looked at meditation. So I've meditated on and off for many years with lots of different practices. Most recently, I went through a Vipassana 10-day intro course, which was incredibly hard for me. And from there, I learned to practice that I will now do. When I was going through the protocol, I did it every day, but now I'll do a little bit more sporadically. And then journaling was another important thing. I find that in my experience, and I guess research also shows this, that when you express your thoughts on paper, going through literally writing things out on paper, it actually uses different motor skills, which then engages your brain a
Yeah.
different way. So expressing what I was feeling on paper allowed me to almost download the things that were happening in here externally so that I can create
Hmm.
some more space in my mind to deal with different things. And then, so that was the fifth practice. And then the two other ones where every night we do this thing called Three Good Things, where when we get together for dinner, we talk about what are the three good things that happened today? What are you grateful for? What's something good that happened? What are you happy for someone else about? So each of us does that, and it kind of helps us look at the day in a different way. And finally, social connection is so incredibly important. What I've noticed in my work is that there are so many people, and this is even more pronounced in men, that don't have a social network where they can share things with. When you're going through a tough time, if you don't have someone to call, you're left kind of isolated and alone. That was incredibly important to have a few good friends that I've made over the years that I've reached out to and talked to. And so that was one practice, and the other part of the practice was to reach out to people in my network just to check in on them. And so
Mm.
this came out of research that I did on how to produce serotonin naturally, which was a whole other story we can talk about sometime. But these were the 7 things that I put into place. So sleep, diet, exercise, meditation, journaling, 3 good things, and social connection. And then on top of all of that, I find that my wife has been such an incredible supporter, and she's been such an incredible gift, and she's been a rock for our family and for myself as I've kind of been set adrift with all of these different losses. So having her in my life has made such a huge difference that I don't know where I would be without her. So those were some
Wow.
things that I put into place.
Well, first of all, kudos to your wife. That's a big deal for sure. But that you've just given us a playbook almost of all of those things, and I feel like those are common. I feel like I've seen these recommendations like sleep. We always hear about sleep, get more sleep. But how much more real that became to you when it was literally changing your body chemistry and the way that you reacted to this situation and help the healing process.
It's very different when you're in it. I feel like there's enough
Yeah.
knowledge around to know the right things to do, and however, how many of us actually put those kind of things into practice. And I'll share one more thing that might be interesting or
Yes.
insightful for some folks, and that is the way that I related to things as I was going through all of this, and where the interfaces would sleep is that one of the ways that I almost subconsciously thought about this was that if I could make this day longer, that meant that I would have more time with them. So there are often times when my dad was going through, my dad was in hospital, where I would just not sleep in order to extend that day. And that was the way that I related to it at the time. And that really messed up a lot of my sleeping as well. And so it took
That's
some time to get to it.
Well, you think even entrepreneurs, you mentioned that at the beginning, and how sometimes we tend to approach our lives and our work and there's no end to our day sometimes, and how that if we don't have boundaries around our time and just compartmentalize some things, how that can just be a runaway train. So that's just another example of not being mindful can end up in a complete mess with health challenges and whatever else we can have going on that's derailing our progress. And also putting these things into practice before we
Mhm.
get to the place of crisis. What a concept, right? Somebody listening, you may feel great today. You may not have health challenges. You may be functioning well and have a successful business. Why not put these things in place now so that when challenges do come, you're that much better equipped to handle them instead of then, having to be in crisis mode and fix everything at the same time.
There is something that I have observed, having worked with a lot of different entrepreneurs and having gone through a lot of different things myself, and that is you often don't necessarily understand the gravity of some of these things until you've had felt experience. And so I see this often in the coaching work that I do, in that when people are building a startup, there's less of a desire to have someone help you, deal with your mental narratives and leadership skills and talking things out with someone until you hit a wall. And
Yeah,
it's
I'm
only
just going to figure it out.
yeah, it's only after you hit a wall you're like, okay, well, I could actually use some support because I don't really know. And so that preventative part of things I think is really important. I think it's also not something that a lot of us prioritize.
Mhm.
And and the other thing that I'll say is that there's no replacement for experience. It's one thing to talk about grief until you actually get hit. It's hard to relate.
Exactly, exactly. So I think even this conversation is valuable to somebody that maybe hasn't even been through it. Maybe this will be important at a time when you do need
Hmm.
these tips and discussion about it. The one other thing I wanted to mention that you said that I really think is important and maybe gets dismissed is when you said you write the journaling part and you were writing things. I teach a lot of people with vision to write it down. And it might seem like a step to skip, but you're right, when you're writing things down, it becomes a different kind of reality for you. When you are reading it back, it's almost like it becomes a little more real and a little more tangible when we are writing things down and can go back and read it. And it's like that cycle just kind of confirms what's on paper. We have a different understanding of it. So I just wanted to mention that because I think that's a really important step. And journaling, absolutely. I know a lot of people say, I'm not really into journaling, but there is power in that process if you can make that a part of your daily routine.
When you mention journaling, so there is what I found, and I'm curious what you think. When I first wanted to start journaling, I actually didn't even know how. And there are so many different methods and modalities: bullet journal, 5-minute journal,
Yeah.
morning pages, flow of stream of consciousness. There are so many different things that sometimes if you're wanting to journal, it's hard to even know where to begin or what fits for you. I've tried a lot of different things, and what I've come to
Mm-hmm.
understand is that it's not necessarily one particular methodology that works for me. It's
Yeah.
a methodology that fits where I'm at the time. So it might be 5 or 6 or 10 different things, and I use them as the situation requires. How do you approach it?
I would completely agree. In fact, I just yesterday was working with a client and we were talking about journaling, and she said, just not really, it's not really my thing. I really struggle with it. And I said that exactly what you just said. It doesn't have to be a deep dive all the time. You can approach journaling with, if you have 5 minutes and you just want to get down what you did in the day and you just wanted to make a couple of notes, completely acceptable, like bullet points. And then on a day where maybe you have more to unpack and you just need to get some things out, maybe it looks different that day. I think we need to get rid of the template for journaling, and whatever it makes sense for you in your life and how you want to approach it is completely up to you. But there's no structure. But I think a lot of people have that misconception. It has to be all these deep feelings every single day and you have to set aside this hour to unpack it all. It does not have to look like that.
If it's helpful for a period of time, I think that's fine. If you
Yep.
are expecting to write, for 2 hours every day for the rest of your life, maybe that's something that works really well for you. It doesn't work very well for me. And so having
No.
the permission to change things up, I think, is something that allows you to use journaling as something that actually fits you personally and uniquely, rather than whatever is prescribed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I have to ask you, Ernest. So I have to ask you, Ernest, how you've been through so much the last few years. How have these experiences really changed the way that you connect with your clients? Have you found that this is a almost like a new beginning to your business? Or how do you see that?
Good question. So, in some ways, it was a hard stop. That was not something that I envisioned for myself.
Mm-hmm.
It was not something that I expected. It just happened. The way that I think I relate to it now is that, so at the point in time while it was happening, I didn't necessarily want to talk to anyone. So I really withdrew from everything and everybody.
Mm-hmm.
If I look at it now, it's all of these experiences have really created a deeper pool of empathy for me. They have created a potentially a deeper capacity to what I call be with. So I have throughout my career have had a chance to work with people that have gone through divorce, people that have gone through loss, through separation, through all kinds of health issues and all kinds of things that are part of the human experience. Yet you don't necessarily hear a lot about them as people are going through them.
Mm-hmm.
Behind the scenes, it can be a very emotional, it can be a very dysregulating period of time. And so, and oftentimes it feels like nobody will understand you. And I find that having that shared human experience of these are the things that happen. I've felt some idea of what it feels like, and I have some level of understanding of what it might feel like for you. I think it allows us to create deeper connections. That's the way that it's coming out, I guess. There was another experience that I've had, just to give a specific example, where I was working with a startup founder, a past founder, an ex-founder, I should say. And
Mm-hmm.
so we had a conversation. There was a takeover, hostile takeover of the company. There was a lot of things that happened where he was essentially ousted out of his own company, and that created a huge emotional toll. And this happened a while ago, but we were having a conversation tail end of last year. So while I was going through all of my stuff and researching grief. And so as he was explaining these things to me, I realized that so I asked him a few questions. Do you feel this? Is this what's showing up? Is this how you're relating to it? And I realized it was a version of grief that he was going through.
Yeah.
And so it's such a universal experience that shows up in different ways. And there was something that uh, I um I remember reading, and I tried to look it up the other day just so I could have it here. And so basically the idea around loss is this is specifically to purpose, but it can also be to a loss of a future. So losing someone isn't just losing what you had; it's losing what you could have had. It's every possibility and hope for the future, many of which you likely never even bothered to think about until they were gone. You grieve the future, not just the past, because it feels like something you were once entitled to. Whether that means a person in my life, whether it means your health, whether that means your possessions, if there's a hurricane or God knows what else that can happen, whether that means some sense of certainty, whether that means your company, these kind of things are the kinds of things that can be very disruptive and dysregulating. And when we lose them, there's a loss of that entire future that we were counting on and being certain about. And so that experience is very universal.
Perfect example, losing a company, something that you've worked so hard for. It's almost like a baby in some form to you. So yes, you're correct. And you said something too about connecting with your clients. You have more empathy. I relate just through some of the experiences and loss and divorce and bankruptcy and different things that I've gone through in my life. So I really relate to that, the empathetic approach to people that I interact with now. And also I will say that the judgment piece just doesn't exist for me anymore. And that really came to mind, that I think as human beings, we sometimes fall into that easily, wanting to, or we have judgment about others. And I find that's really just kind of disappeared in many ways, because who am I to judge? I
Mhm.
realize the situations we all go through and the experiences we have, we can't judge another person's journey and how they react and how they deal with the situation. So I think that that is also something. Does that resonate with you?
It does. I find myself in a very similar, having some very similar thoughts in the sense that um, you don't know what people are going through. And so many of us hide it. So many of us don't share it, which is fine. Um, And on the other side of that is just having some more compassion for your fellow human beings is,
Yeah,
I think, incredibly important. It can make a significant difference. And yet sometimes that compassion and that empathy has to be earned through personal experience. Not for everybody, but for some folks, it's almost like, you see this in philanthropy quite a bit where you might have a family that's fairly well off, and they've donated to certain causes, or maybe they haven't, but then somebody in their family experiences cancer, and all of a sudden they're now very attuned to it, and they will fund cancer research or donate to hospital foundations, or those kind of things. And so, but without that experience, they wouldn't have been attuned to it. And so once you realize that there are so many experiences that we haven't experienced that other people have, that once you go through a few tough things, it seems like you earn the understanding of others a little bit better.
exactly. Yes. So I just want to ask you one more question quickly here, and it has to do with, it connects to a comment you made about maybe even grieving the vision that we had for our lives, for our business, what we could have had, and maybe we've lost that now. And with all of the changes that you're experiencing and have experienced in your life, in your business, has your vision shifted at all? And if so, how has it?
There are a few things that shifted, and there are a few things that solidified. That's a good question, because some of these experiences can really reshape who you are. I remember interviewing someone, his name is Sean Askinosie, who used to be an attorney. And after his dad passed away, he went and stayed in a monastery for a couple of months. And then when he came out, he started building a chocolate factory. So that was a really transformative
Oh, wow.
experience. And then he and Eskinosi chocolates are they do some really great work in where cocoa is farmed and harvested, and they work with local schools where they're factories, and they send like little school kids to where cocoa is being produced. Um, and so that was a transformative experience for that person. For me, I feel like I've been on a path that, or on a journey, I should say, that was fairly aligned with the kind of work that I want to do and the kind of impact I want to do. And so the things that really solidified for me is around the idea of creating that future that I want to live in and that I want my daughter to live in. And so for me, there's an intersection of innovation and impact that is where I want to do work. There's also another thing that I think is important to understand. This is something I learned from one of my teachers and mentors. He talks about this idea of essence and form. So a form could be an expression like, this is what my business looks like, this is how I do coaching, this is the job that I have, this is how I cook, or whatever else. But there's an essence behind all of that that is essentially who you are without all those forms. You can take different forms, but the essence remains the same. And so for me, all of these experiences have really reinforced to me for me, the essence is around creating as positive impact as I can while I'm alive. And so whether that comes through coaching, consulting, building a company, doing some kind of a job that might be something that I didn't necessarily see right now, working in an accelerator to help other entrepreneurs build their businesses, whatever that looks like, as long as it's aligned with that essence, I am much, much better with now. I used to hold on to things very tightly in terms of, this is exactly how I wanted something to work out. And so if it didn't work out that way, it was a failure. I think I'm a lot more flexible with that now, and as long as it's aligned with the essence of who I am, then it makes it an easier decision and a lighter way of moving through life.
Oh, that's beautiful. And just the realization of all of those things is so powerful. And I relate in many ways. And the other thing I'll add to that for myself is the feeling of accelerating that. I feel like I don't want to waste any time,
Mm.
because I want to make sure that impact that I want to have for my own family and for the part of the world that I feel like I'm supposed to impact, that I want to get going. I don't want to waste any more time. Do you feel like that sometimes? Like you just want to get going?
It's a really good question. So I was I was just talking to someone about this recently, actually this morning. On all of my different assessments, behavioral assessments, urgency, self-starter, quick to action are at the very top for me. So I have a problem with patience. And so I like to get started, I like to get building, I like to develop things, I like to move, I like things to happen quickly. One of the things that I've learned even in the last couple of months is to exercise more of my patience. There are things that I want to move. However, there are also things that are way outside of my control that I can't necessarily
Yeah.
influence directly or as quickly as I want.
Yeah.
And so for me, one of the lessons was learning to be patient and letting things take their course. And at the same time, doing what I can to move things in that kind of a direction. So it's kind of like a little bit of both.
Yeah.
Ideally, I would like things to move really fast and everything resolves quickly. However, that isn't always the pace at which the rest of the world moves.
I think that's a perfect balance to what I just said. And thank you for bringing that in, because I think that has to play a factor as well. Okay, just really quickly as we sign off, what's next for you, Ernest? What's coming up that you're excited about?
There are a few interesting things, but I'm going to so I'll tell you about that, and then I'll back up with one thing that's been is almost like a guiding force. So I'm working on a couple of different programs. Some have to do with AI and leadership. I am also in conversations with some really good people about accelerating entrepreneurs in the blue economy and in the impact space. And so behind all of that, there was something that's what's on my radar right now. So I'm
Okay.
I'm I'm looking for opportunities to be more involved in that space and make more of an impact in that space, because that's what I believe in. And uh, Backing up a step, there was someone that I connected with just recently that I've done some coaching with. And one piece of feedback that he gave me a year after we completed our coaching is that he was in a much better place now in terms of creating his next thing, because one of the things that we talked about was, who do you want to spend your time with? And
Oh,
so that became a guiding question that allowed him to now be connected with some really great people, and out of being in those connections with people that he wanted to be around with, there are some new opportunities that are coming up. And I'm experiencing a very similar thing. So being clear about who do I really enjoy spending time with, and how can I serve in that space, makes opens up some serendipitous possibilities that you can't even see yet. And that's been my experience recently.
that's exciting. So we will have some links to how to get in touch with Ernest on a link to this podcast. And so we can follow your journey forward. I'm really excited to see where you take things. And I just want to say thank you so much for sharing so openly and honestly about it's a very personal journey and you've been very transparent. So I thank you for that because I know it's going to help somebody listening with their own journey. Something you've said, something in this conversation, I believe is going to help somebody with unpacking and moving forward in their own chapters. So we are going to be paying attention to what comes next for you because I know it will be rich and transformative because that's what you're setting out to do. So thank you so much, Ernest, for being here today.
Thanks, Kim. It was really great to have this conversation with you, and thanks for inviting me. This was really great. I hope it's helpful.
Absolutely. And thanks, of course, to all of you for tuning in. We'll see you next time.